Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hey, welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and it's my joy to walk through 2 Corinthians with you in our year-long study through the New Testament. Today, we are studying 2 Corinthians 10. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co. shop or with the reading plan linked in the show notes. If someone calls you two-faced, it's pretty clear it's not a compliment. It means that you act differently in front of people than you do behind closed doors. It's an attack on someone's integrity. And this is a charge that someone from Corinth brought up against Paul. That Paul's letters are weighty and powerful, and yet his physical presence and public speaking are weak. In chapter 10, Paul moves on from discussing the upcoming collection and back to defending his ministry. There's a pretty clear tone shift here from Paul in this chapter, so much so that some believe that chapters 10 through 13 of 2 Corinthians are an entirely different letter. Doubts about Paul's integrity were a big deal. But remember, Paul does not defend himself for his own sake, but for the sake of defending the gospel. If Paul is not deemed trustworthy, likely his gospel would not be trustworthy either. Paul addresses these claims head-on so that nothing would hinder the gospel in Corinth. What's so beautiful about this chapter and the chapters to come is that Paul does not defend the power of his own presence. He does not boast in his accomplishments, but rather he will continue to share in his weaknesses, teaching how his weaknesses lead him to minister in Christ's power, not his own. First, Paul's appeal is that his attitude of meekness and gentleness is modeled after Christ's own attitude. Some opponents were criticizing Paul's Christ-likeness and possibly influencing the Corinthians to doubt Paul. Their accusations of Paul's untrustworthiness is actually the exact reason that he is trustworthy. He is committed to living like Jesus lived. His testimony is lived out not just in word, but in deed. Paul begs the Corinthians to accept him and his ministry so that he can remain in gentleness and meekness among them. But he anticipates needing to be bold in person soon. Even so, his weapons against the false beliefs are not weapons as the world knows, like violence or coercion or shame. No, his weapon is the gospel, the cross of Christ, the truth that is able to demolish any stronghold that rises up against it. Jesus will always be victorious. Nothing can stand in Christ's way. And so Paul will exercise his authority to discipline those against him if necessary. But Paul's first desire is peace, to continue ministering to his brothers and sisters in Corinth in meekness and gentleness. Christ gave him authority not for tearing down, but for building up, for the encouragement of the churches, not for their shame. Paul reminds the church that just as they belong to Christ, so does he. Their accusations against him are according to the world's standards, not Jesus's. Their accusations deem his gospel untrustworthy, and for this, Paul is willing to take bold action in person, just as he has been bold in his letters. Even if Paul must take bold action, he assures the Corinthians that he will not be boasting outside of his means. He is only boasting in what Christ has done through him. In fact, the Corinthian church is evidence of the success of Paul's ministry. Paul's ministry reached even to Corinth. Paul does not boast outside of his means or claim others' works as his own. Paul boasts only in the work that God has done within his life, because God's work proclaims God's power. That's why Paul quotes Jeremiah 9:24 in verse 17. He says, "Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord." Whatever boasting Paul does, it is to proclaim Christ. This chapter is a good example of why Paul defends his ministry so vigilantly throughout 2 Corinthians. For by defending his ministry, he defends the one who established his ministry. Paul defends Christ. He demolishes any strongholds that come up against the gospel flourishing in Corinth and beyond. I can imagine that Paul's heart broke as he heard claims of him being two-faced. I can imagine anger too, that his ministry would be judged based on the world's standards and not on Christ's character. This is just another way that Paul follows in Jesus' footsteps. For Christ too was misunderstood by those he loved. Isaiah 53 describes Christ as someone despised and rejected by God's own beloved nation, Israel. They misinterpreted the signs based on their own human understanding. As Paul pens his letter, misunderstood as he is, he has great comfort knowing that Jesus is with him not only in power, but in understanding. Christ experienced weakness, the pain of rejection. He rests with Paul in sympathy, for he has been there too. He's been there and he's been victorious. In John 16:33, Jesus guarantees suffering, but encourages us that he has overcome the world. No matter what happens with the Corinthians, if they truly understand Paul's ministry or if they continue to reject him, Christ remains victorious. It's a truth that holds no matter what. We will see tomorrow that Paul's worries that the Corinthians' judgment based on human standards will leave them vulnerable to false gospels. Paul's posture towards the Corinthians is love that desires their ultimate good. And the ultimate good of the Corinthians is to know Christ, to really know him, the true gospel. And that's our ultimate good too, friends. The gospel needs no addition, no human flair or impressive speech. Jesus is enough. He can do great things through our weaknesses, through a posture of gentleness and meekness. I can't wait to continue studying this idea throughout the next few chapters.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.